Good evening. My name is Bob Bernhardt, and good afternoon to many of you, I guess. I'm fortunate to be the chair of Learning for a Sustainable Future, your host for tonight's session. Um, Welcome to this fifth annual Dr. David V.J. Bell Memorial Lecture. I'd like to begin this session by acknowledging the many territories on which we gather virtually today across Turtle Island as the ancestral homelands of the many diverse Indigenous peoples. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work and learn together on these lands. We must also acknowledge the importance of incorporating the Indigenous ways of knowing into our actions, especially when it comes to climate conversations and climate action, as they provide essential knowledge and wisdom that has been and will continue to be instrumental in the fight against climate change. Alongside this land acknowledgement, we like to honor an Indigenous artist from our own territory. The beautiful piece you see here is by Anishinaabe artist Zawano Gizek, depicting the traditional interconnected worldview of the Ojibwe Anishinaabe who have inhabited the North American Great Lakes area for at least 1,000 years. Now, a word about the lecture. Dr. Bell became a member of Learning for a Sustainable Future in 1995. He became chair of the board of directors in 2006 and served in that role until his passing in January 2017. His passion, commitment, and dedication to sustainability and education over those 22 years left a permanent imprint on policymakers, educators, and youth across Canada and internationally. David had a long and accomplished career in academia at York University. He was a professor of political science, dean of the Faculty of Graduate Studies, and dean of the Faculty of Environmental Studies, among other roles. In addition to his academic work, David was a member of the National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy and chair of the board of directors of Downsview Park. He received many awards over his lifetime, all richly deserved, most notably the Green Toronto Award for Leadership and Sustainability, the 2016 Harry Jerome Award, the Clean 50 Award, and the Jackie Robinson Fortitude Award. LSF would not be where we are today if not for his leadership and countless contributions. The Dr. David V.J. Bell Memorial Fund supports this lecture and David's important legacy of empowering our children to change the world. I also want to thank York Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change for their support of this lecture, and I would like to invite the Acting Dean, Philip Kelly, to bring greetings on behalf of York University. Philip.
Thank you very much, Bob. We are delighted to co-sponsor this event with Learning for a Sustainable Future. And this is obviously a special occasion for our faculty, the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. Although we're York's newest faculty, we build on a long legacy of environmental studies at York, in fact, the longest in any Canadian university. And as Bob has just mentioned, David Bell was the Dean of Environmental Studies in the 1990s. I'm also really delighted and honored to be here to listen to Dr. Elin Kelsey. Elin's distinguished thought leadership will be introduced in a moment, but her message of hope amid mindsets of environmental doom is incredibly important to us in our faculty as we try to educate the next generation of environmentally and socially conscious and active citizens. When we were created as a faculty 4 years ago, inevitably it was partly framed in a narrative of crisis and challenge and emergency. But at the same time, we're not seeking to inculcate hopelessness and doom-filled critique in our students. We're also trying to shape active citizens who have the tools and the capabilities to create change. And Ellen's message is incredibly important in that. We have new programs that we created 3 years ago that try to do this. Sustainable environmental management shows students how biodiversity conservation and energy transitions can work. Our cities regions planning program has a unique emphasis on the natural world of the city as well as the social world. Our environmental science program includes hands-on skills to understand environmental processes at all scales, from local to global. Our global geography program has students thinking about their citizenship in a world of interconnected global environmental, social, economic, and political processes. And our unique environmental arts and justice program creates thinkers who explore the change-making potential of the arts and humanities. And our graduate programs in environmental studies and geography have half a century of thought leadership in critical approaches to the environment. But we do always need reminding that critique only goes so far, and we need to take a hopeful, solutions-oriented approach. And I'm really happy that Elin Kelsey and her work is always there to remind us of that. So that's my welcome remarks, my promotional pitch disguises welcome remarks, but I do genuinely welcome everybody. I'm really looking forward to our discussion this evening. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Philip, and thank you for the work of you and your faculty in moving the world along, helping us get to where we need to be and where I think people like Elin will convince us we actually can be. I'm now pleased to introduce the son of Dr. Bell. And in doing so, you saw the picture of David playing his bass at the front. He was a wonderful, wonderful individual with many aspects of his life. And one was, I think, to be a strong, wonderful father. So I'm very pleased to introduce his son, Jason Bell. Jason, words from the family.
Thanks, Bob. It's great to see that this tradition is carried on, and I'm so excited about today's lecture. I did do a little dive into some of Elin's work, and encourage everyone who's going to see this lecture today to have a look at her website and follow the rabbit holes. This lecture today is something that I'm sure my dad would really appreciate, and the role of hope in being able to bring about change. And I'm very much looking forward to it. And I want to give thanks on behalf of the family for all that you're doing and for coming out today. Looking forward to the lecture, Elin. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason, and I really appreciate you joining us. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of Learning for a Sustainable Future. And if you look at all that has been accomplished by this organization, you would think it must be very large. I think here's one of 5 full-time staff, the leader, Pam. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what a remarkable job by so few. Please let others know about it.
Thanks so much, Bob. Yes, 5 full-time staff, and 4 of us are on the call on the lecture tonight. So want to thank Elaine and Jen and Gigi and Sam, who is not on tonight's lecture. So a little bit about Learning for a Sustainable Future, or LSF, as we're affectionately known. LSF is a bilingual charity founded in 1991. Our focus is education for sustainable development in the K-12 school systems. We work with business, government, school boards, universities, communities, educators, and youth across Canada. Our strategic priorities include a focus on research, youth engagement, support for teachers, and awards. Our recent climate change education survey of over 4,000 Canadian parents, teachers, students, and the general public identified strong support for climate change education in our schools and a significant need to support teachers with professional development and resources. LSF's workshops and webinars help enhance teacher confidence in teaching about sustainability and climate change. Our Resources for Rethinking database hosts over 1,800 peer-reviewed, curriculum-matched classroom resources for teachers. In 2023, LSF engaged 350 classes and 6,000 students in youth forums and 560 classes and 230,000 students in sustainability action projects. All of those projects posted on the LSF Our Canada Project website. LSF Sustainable Future Schools, 30 and Growing, takes a whole school approach to engaging staff, students, administrators, parents, and the community in using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as a lens through which to address school culture, curriculum, teaching and learning, and community partnerships. So much of our work focuses on giving young people hope and agency, so necessary in this current climate. We're so thrilled to have Elin with us tonight to share her research. And this lecture was really established. David spent so much of his life translating that research into practice. And our hope tonight is that we'll be inspired by Elin's words and translate that into practice in supporting our teachers and young people.
Thank you very much, Pam. And I hope people caught that. Almost 250,000 students impacted last year by Learning for a Sustainable Future. As an educator for over 40 years, I can assure you I have not impacted anywhere near that number. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Elin Kelsey. We'll have time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please post your questions in the Zoom Q&A box and we'll do our best to answer them. So Dr. Elin Kelsey is an award-winning author, speaker, and thought leader for the evidence-based hope and climate justice solutions movement. Kelsey's influence can be seen through the popularity of her book, Hope Matters: Why Changing the Way We Think is Critical for Solving the Environmental Crisis, and in the hopeful solutions focus of her clients, including the Monterey Bay Aquarium and other powerful institutions where she has served as a visiting fellow, including the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Cone Foundation, the Salish Sea Institute, the Cairns Institute, and Stanford University. She co-created the viral social media campaign, #Ocean Optimism, and is currently leading intergenerational collaborations with climate influencers to make evidence-based hope more shareable online. She is an adjunct faculty member of the University of Victoria School of Environmental Studies and Western Washington University School of Environment. She regularly serves as an author, artist in residence for international schools. She is a best-selling children's book author, podcast host, and film writer, and she is someone we are delighted to have with us tonight. Dr. Kelsey.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful organization you have. You can really feel that culture of collaboration amongst all of you, and it's my pleasure to be with all of you tonight. What I'll do now is I'd love to just jump into essentially a discussion around the importance of hope from the perspective of engagement with the serious issues of climate justice that we face. So I'll be really running through an argument, a rationale, I guess. And then from that, we're really looking forward to a robust question and answer time. And the chat is, of course, available to all of us. And I would love for you to start in on that right away. And you can hold a conversation there, and then we'll do it as a collective in about half an hour's time. So I'm just going to share my screen and get started here. How's that feeling? Let it load. That's great. Thank you, everyone. And I would too like to acknowledge the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory I am very lucky to be speaking to you from, and the Sanghi, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich people, whose historical relationships with this extraordinary place that we now call Canada or Victoria continues to this day. So I wanted to start out with this idea of emotions. You know, when we used to talk about our sustainability goals and how we would engage, we would think very, very much about what we knew, with the idea that if we just knew better, we would somehow act better. But we now know from this vast field of climate emotions that how we feel also has a tremendous influence on what we feel capable of doing, our agency, whether we feel we can do that collectively with others. And you'll well know that there are many terms now that have come to light as the field of climate emotions has grown, things like eco-anxiety. So this feeling that we have about really no future, or the sense of doom, that we feel betrayal in terms of the institutions that were supposed to help us and look after us. So there's been really some very important work done internationally around measuring eco-anxiety, especially amongst the, students in the age groups that many of us are working with. Ellen Field, the wonderful researcher at Lakehead University, did a major study last year, and this is looking at Canadian students. So again, half of them thinking that humanity is doomed. Those are very, very strong feelings. And I'm pleased to say also a feeling that we can do something, but how do we put those things together? I think what is important when we look at this work is that the high levels, 3 out of 4 young people, this is the largest international survey to date. And again, feeling that the future is frightening or doomed, and that there is a betrayal going on. So therefore, that creates high levels of skepticism and cynicism. This really matters because when we look at studies like this one, we ask people if they care about climate change. They absolutely do. But do they have confidence that we can do anything about it? And we see very little confidence. That doomism comes in and causes us to feel real hopelessness. And that's so disempowering at a time when we need to stay as engaged as possible. So again, studies like this one showing that if you believe climate change is unstoppable, you're much less likely to engage with it, which makes sense, right? If it really is unstoppable, why would one spend their time? So these feelings that we have really matter. And perhaps one of the most important points I'm trying to make is that our feelings are absolutely based in the reality of the situation. We are in a climate justice crisis. We're in a biodiversity crisis. We're in a pandemic. We know these things to be true. And our feelings are based on our thoughts and our beliefs and our mindsets and the way in which we hear about things. And that's why when we look at things, you know, there's a lot of environmental journalism research now that shows us that less than 3% of all media stories about climate change even mention a solution. So that means that we almost only hear, importantly, about what's not working, but almost nothing about what is working. And when that happens, we take away this idea that nothing is working. And that can cause us to feel paralyzed, discouraged, cynical, disempowered. And the same thing, unfortunately, often happens in our classroom settings, so that when we focus so much on these problems, then we end up in a situation where we inadvertently create a culture of doom in classes. And students write things like this, you know, I thought that when I got hit by all the problems at the beginning, I'd hear the second half focused on the solutions, but that isn't happening. So again, the way we construct our teaching really matters around this. Now, in a way, it makes sense because these are such urgent issues. There's a tendency to think we just have to get the word out. But the word is out. So we see massive studies like this showing, you know, half the world's population, of that half, 64%, believe climate change is a global emergency. So people are very aware of this as a problem. That is not our issue. Our issue is more now this fatalism that causes us to feel hopeless and to give up on things when we need to be there. And that's why I really believe this, and why I think hope is so critical. So some practices that matter to this: creating safe spaces to share our feelings. So just knowing we all have lots of feelings. And this is one particular graphic from Panu Pikala, a wonderful Finnish researcher who's doing lots and lots of work creating phase models of eco-anxiety, for example, to help give us words and ways of thinking about the feelings we're having. I'm happy to say I was able to co-create this wonderful website with climate climate justice educators all over the world who are working in the emotion sphere. And so even though it's a very heavy, long name, if you go there, you'll see lots of resources of ways to engage in creating safe spaces. Another important practice for feeling hopeful is to immerse yourself in up-to-date trends of things that are moving in the directions we need more of. And I'm happy to say that in the time I've been thinking and talking about hope, over the last 15 or 20 years, there's been this huge surge in what's called solutions journalism. So it's a form of journalism that looks just as rigorously at how things work as it does at what's broken. And there are now many sources of rigorously based, evidence-based solutions that we can look at and even subscribe to, so we get them as a regular feed on our email or other things. I want to underscore that solutions doesn't mean fixed forever. It means the best possible responses we have at this time. And that means things are always changing. And so I've become really aware of the need for an expiry date on what we believe, because we often think around climate change and biodiversity, for example, that things are only going from, bad to worse. And so this expiry date matters. So here we have back, not that long ago, really looking at air quality in Beijing, in China. So it's important to look now at where is that, what's happened in that. And when we do that, when we bother to do the hard work of finding, are we out of date? I'm often astonished at how much things have shifted. And that's important. And of course, things also shift in the wrong directions, but knowing the state of play is crucial, because people who have a good knowledge about how the world has changed are much more optimistic about things we can do. Again, an empowerment standpoint. So I think a beautiful example of this is that 42% of people on Earth are 25 years of age or younger. It's the largest demographic on Earth. And we know that the two values that are strongest across that age group are social justice and climate change. So that's why I'm speaking about a climate justice crisis. We saw that, and we know that the justice aspect of this is crucial, because climate change does absolutely disproportionately disadvantage disadvantaged communities. And so that justice orientation is really appropriate and necessary. So when we saw these massive movements around climate change, youth-driven movements back in 2019, and then the pandemic hit, it led many of us to believe, oh, climate change sort of fell off the scope. People were no longer looking. That is not true. We, as a result of those marches and that focus, now 1 in 8 people on the planet live in a place that has declared a climate emergency, which brings with it a requirement of climate action planning. So that's a tremendous response. And we can look in other areas to see movement. So we can look at the movement towards net zero. Back in 2019, we had 77 countries signing on. Here in 2023, 137 countries having signed on. And of course, these sign-ons are only part of it. We have to hold those governments accountable. And there are now more ways of us doing that. There are many more metrics to show us how well are we doing with these pledges that we're making, so that we can hold accountable. And when we know what's working, we can use that as a way of demanding more of that. Now, we know, for example, that we have made collectively, globally, an incredible impact on the ozone hole level, or ozone hole layer. What we may or may not realize is that the same protocol that led to that ozone success is now looking at refrigerants. And refrigerants turn out to be one of the most important things for us to tackle. So I think it's important for me to know personally that, 7 years ago, that same body ratified agreements around refrigerants, so that when I see this piece of media, I understand that that is something moving in the directions we need more of. We're seeing a lot of change in financing, global green financing in the last years. And many of you will have been involved in divestment movements, to move away the amount that we're investing in fossil fuels. It's important to see that we're not alone in that action and what has already been accomplished. We see a mass transit revolution around the world. And that's being driven partly by youth who are saying, you know, it's not just for us to have to use cars. We're demanding that kind of transit. And so we see lots of people now choosing not to have cars, not to have driver's licenses. We see countries recognizing that and making changes. We see this just happened a few days ago, where we see a shift in offshore oil permits being surrendered, large movements of voters around saying, no, thank you. And we see this is, you'll notice everything has a date because I'm really keen on this expiry date idea. This just came through 5 days ago. You know, they've been talking about these short haul flight bans in Europe. It's now come into play. So it started with Austria, moved to France, and they're now looking at an EU-wide level. And at the same time, we're seeing changes in terms of how do we disincentivize and how do we incentivize more climate-friendly movement. This is one that many of you will be involved in. I'm wearing a sweater that I got from my sister. The secondhand clothing market is now one of the largest parts of clothing overall as a global movement. And that is, again, being driven by youth and being picked up by people of many ages. The largest growing trend in food right now is plant-based eating. And that really matters because plant-based eating, as you'll know from the Sustainable Development Goal focus that you do, turns out to be, you know, amongst the top-based things that we on an individual basis can do in terms of reducing climate change impacts. So eating plant-rich diets and reducing food waste are number 1 and number 2 in Project Drawdown, which is a massive big data set that looks at quantifiably what are the things that have the biggest impacts. So that's exciting to know that movement's happening. We see changes in rights going on, not only around our rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, but we also see court cases. And it's important to see that momentum moving from this many cases in this many jurisdictions to this many cases in this many. And of course, we need more of all of this. I'm in no way saying any of this is a done deal, but what I am saying is it's important to know where the momentum is sitting. This is an area that is really happening, especially driven amongst youth, which is looking at how do we stop our focus on a belief in infinite growth and consumption and look at growth of things like public transit or public health. The idea of well-being being the most important measure. And so we see the emergence of things like climate quitting. So 1 in 3 18 to 24-year-olds have rejected a job offer based on the environment, social, and governance commitments of the organization or company thinking about hiring them. That's a powerful force to demand those changes. If we move from climate to think about plastic, we see a lot of concern. And I think this really matters because when we are confronted by the obscenity of so much plastic pollution, we can feel so demoralized. So it's important to know we are collectively as a globe concerned about that. There are programs all over the world focused on plastic bag bans now. And now enough of them have been in place that we're able to quantifiably show that those bans have meaningful impacts. Lots of research showing that now. And you may or may not know that there's also a very large UN treaty being assembled around plastic pollution at the scale of the Biodiversity Convention and the Climate Change Convention. Again, a reflection of global recognition of these problems. Another whole area, of course, is the waste of electronics. And so relatively recent shifts around the right to repair bill in the United States and also in Canada. This is a fascinating particular piece of research that shows that we have already done enough progress to remove the most worst case scenario of climate warming. We've dropped it by 1 degree. It's not enough, but it's important to know we've already achieved that. So we are not at the starting line. And I try as a person and as an educator, rather than falling into the language of, if we do this, then this will happen. I try to always say, because people have already done these things, we're here, and therefore we know we need to amplify this. So we're noticing what we've already accomplished to empower us to continue forward with those things that need to be amplified. For me, this is one of the most hopeful things. We really recognize now that biodiversity and nature-based solutions are critical to species and ecosystems, and also for climate change. So we've seen this large focus now on protecting 30% of land and ocean by the year 2030. Again, we have to hold governments accountable to that. But I was excited to see just 2 days ago in the EU, the 20%, so it came down from 30 to 20, but actually enshrined into law. So it's exciting to watch the movement happening and to see graphs like these, in addition to graphs that show us the problems that we face. What we measure matters. Now, a lot of what's driving these ecosystem protected areas is coming from First Nations. And that is an exciting area to watch happening. And it's happening, and it means that ecological restoration and actions are happening in lots of different kinds of ways that take into account traditional knowledge and Western scientific knowledge. This slide I have to update all of the time because the number keeps growing. Marine protected areas are a very active area right now. And again, they're fraught with difficulties in terms of enforcement and in terms of what's meant in them. But the trend of marine protected areas and knowing how influential they are on ecological recovery is also true. This is something I thought would never happen. I've been working in marine protected areas for over 30 years, and we now see high seas treaties. So not only what nation states are doing in their own territorial waters, but what happens in the vast part of the ocean between nation states. Changes in terms of the way we regard and influence and interact with other species. This one's exciting, tuna. So 4 of the 7 tuna species are now no longer endangered. This to me is a massive accomplishment because you may or may not know, tunas are highly migratory. They cross, much of the globe. They are the #1 species of fish that we eat around the world, and they have highly complicated life cycles. So to accomplish that, to move in the right direction with them is a huge accomplishment, and is a result of over 30 years of fishers, policymakers, scientists all pushing in that direction. And these are just a number of trends that I try to keep watch on that are moving in directions we need them to go and need more of. So another thing I think in the practice of hope is to really notice and nurture the resilience of other species. And that's because we're only one of 8.7 million other species. That's the most commonly held view of the number right now. So we need to also notice things like the resilience of certain coral species, because when we know that, we can support them. We know that resilient coral species that happen to also be in marine protected areas do even better. We know that when we stop mercury pollution, freshwater fish can recover. That's important to know. And in no way am I saying that that's okay that those rivers are in that condition. But what I am saying is it's important to know that resilience also exists so that we can support it. Amazing examples of river recoveries going on all over the world. Extremophiles. So not long ago, we used to think life could only exist in what was called the Goldilocks zone. Couldn't be too cold, too hot, too high, that kind of stuff. It turns out there's all kinds of life forms that are able to exist in sulfuric acid, at possibly hot temperatures and possibly cold temperatures under incredible pressure deep in the earth. And extremophiles are being used quite a lot in mining reclamation and other forms. Wildfires are a massive concern all over the world. So I like to try to find out always what happened after the worst. And this happens to be in a state park very close to where I spend a lot of time. What happened 3 years ago was a massive fire. So what's happening now? Are those forests recovering, and in what ways, and how do we best support that? Along the coast of British Columbia, and actually parts of California, and now moving up into Oregon State, sea otters are recovering. That's fantastic because we know that when sea otters recover, the amount of kelp recovery happens at a very profound level. And we know that kelp is super important to ecosystems and CO2 capture. And so seeing initiatives like this one, Coastal Voices, is a project going on in British Columbia, which brings together elders and knowledge keepers with Western scientists to say, as sea otters recover in British Columbia, what's the management plan forward that is healthy from a traditional practices point of view and healthy from an ecosystem point of view? So exciting to watch these sorts of important collaborations. Here, where I'm sitting talking to you, can't see because of the beautiful backdrop, but it's been a record-breaking year for the recovery of humpback whales and big killer whales. And that's true for the last 7 years that I've been looking at it. That really matters because humpback whales are recovering all over the world. There's only 2 populations I know of that aren't. Most of them are recovering faster than people predicted. And in fact, whales have such a big impact on capturing carbon that they are rated at between $1 and $2 million per whale in terms of its impact on carbon capture. And we're able to, because of our capacity to digitally track now whales all over the world, we can see where they actually move. And maps like these are now huge big data sets coming together to help us understand other species and what matters to them. And this map, for example, is also being used by international shippers to see where are these areas where ship strikes are more likely to happen, and how do we deal with that kind of issue. So that kind of data really matters. What we measure matters, and this is a beautiful example. So the World Conservation Union, which is the largest assemblage of conservation organizations in the world, used to and still does have the red list of endangered species. So we know how threatened, endangered, or vulnerable a species is. Just in the last few years, they've added a green list. And the green list also measures then what are the things we do that are keeping those species from being endangered or moving us in the direction of back to thriving. And so both measures really matter. We see changes in our understanding of the capability of other species. And we see things like individuality. So better recognition that even these tiny, crabs have personalities and differences. And so we know in social sciences, we talk about weird. We don't want to just look at Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic countries when we're doing our research. We want to see a diversity of people. And the same thing is true now in other species science. So researchers saying we don't want to just see animals that have been trapped or reared in captivity or that sort of thing. We need a broader diversity of representation. We see a recognition of diversity happening in all different places, like the way in which we name other species and changes around that. We recognize large top of the food chain predators and animals at the top being really critical to climate change, whether they are elephants or tiger sharks. And we know that time spent outside, that's another incredibly important practice, is so important to our mental health, our emotional health, and our spiritual health, our capacity to deal with these problems that we face. The last thing I really wanted to talk on in terms of a practice of hope is to really know yourself and to act from your unique positionality or identity. So, it is important to know the top things we can do, like plant-based eating, that matters. But I think what matters almost as much is what we really care about. So whether we are identifying culturally about who we are, there's a group doing that, or whether it's through our gender orientation, there are ways of joining there, or whether it's through our indigeneity, or whether it's through our faith-based organizations. Every major faith on earth has declared a climate emergency. So there is action going on there, or whether it's through ability or disability. Many of you will know Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, a wonderful climate activist, talks very much about our action through joy. So what are you good at? What work needs most doing? And what brings you joy? And putting yourself in that beautiful center space as where you most actively engage. Because again, to be empowered on these crucially difficult issues, requires fortitude and staying with it. So if we do it from a position of really belonging and meaningfulness, we're much more likely to stay with it. It was kindly mentioned in the introduction, this is an area very close to my heart right now. Most people in that 42% of people on the planet find their climate information online. And we really need to collectively work with climate influencers to look at the way we share climate information online, including how doomism is spread and how evidence-based hope is spread. So I've been working on a number of projects with Queer Brown Vegan around making that change. And we're currently, I've been working with high school students like Uliana here of how we use announcements in high schools, because every school has announcements, to talk about time-stamped shifts that are moving in the directions we need them to be as just part of the things we hear about daily at school. You're welcome to join Uliana and I and many other youth who are holding an unconference of hope on April 3rd to 6th in Hamilton, Ontario. And our goal is to be there and collaborate intergenerationally, because that sense of betrayal that I mentioned at the very beginning is not just around institutions, it's around age. There's a lot of sense of betrayal, and we are most powerful when we bring ourselves collectively and collaboratively to these things, rather than a sense, I think many youth feel, that they are left with the problem to solve. So this is the point I'm trying to make, is that hope is many things. You know, I was happy enough to work a chapter on the Oxford Compendium of Hope, which is the largest collection of people writing about hope ever, which will be published this year. And my point around hope is that it's a stance as much as it is a feeling or a philosophical standpoint. It's choice to be hopeful, because it's through hope that we are able to stay with really difficult things. And the kind of hope I'm talking about is hope that is evidence-based, where we can see which things are getting us in the directions we need more of, and we can throw ourselves behind those. So I'm going to stop with that and look forward to speaking with all of you about this.
Thank you, Ellen. That was absolutely great. I want to assure you that you weren't just trying to provide hope to us, you actually did. I'm feeling much more hopeful, and I suspect many others are as well. I hope people appreciate that Ellen started with a description of where we sit now, and particularly in terms of how people feel about climate change and their worries, and about how unsubstantiated some of those worries should be given the progress we've already made. She didn't give us her opinions of how to move forward. She gave us knowledge, and that knowledge was based on evidence. It was repeated throughout her presentation. And then she gave us some marching orders at the end in terms of how we should take this and help produce a sense of agency in others, particularly our young, but also adults, so that they believe that they can make a real difference. And finally, I want to thank you for giving me an idea for books for several of my grandchildren as birthdays roll ahead in the near future. At this point, I'd like to ask Jen and Genevieve, two of the very important staff at LSF, to handle the questions.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Ellen. So the first question that came in was from Tony, and he asked, how do we engage the political class to create the regulatory framework that is vital for change to create hope and opportunity for future generations when voters' selfish interests always pushes things to status quo direction?
All of these are such good questions. And I think one of the things the Solutions Journalism Network talks about as being sort of core to solutions journalism is complicating the narrative. That whenever we have a simplistic narrative, and doomism is a simplistic narrative, you know, everything is broken, or fatalism. It's not only broken, it's going to stay broken. And so I think what I try to do, and in answer to that wonderful question Tony made, is I try to look always at multiple scales of politics. So, and I was trying to do that in my presentation in the sense of showing international examples, national examples. Turns out cities are hugely important to climate change action. Mayors of cities have a lot of power. because that's often where, things like our waste treatment and how we move around and these kinds of things are happening at a mayoral level. And many cities in the world are huge. And we are living now in a planet that is mostly, more people live in an urban place than not. So that's what I do, is I try to look and see what's going on at different scales in terms of regulatory frameworks, for example, and then using examples. Like one of the things I've really learned from journalists is they sometimes find it hard to move to solutions journalism because they feel that their job is to hold power accountable. And it is to hold power accountable, but you can also hold power accountable by showing this over here is working. Here we see what's happening regulatorily around airplane flights, for example, in France, and we want it where we are. So you can use when you see what is happening in one area, you can really use it to hold power accountable. And so that's what I would answer, is to look across those sections, see where things are working, and then using that to push for what you want more of.
Thank you, Ellen. We have another question from the Q&A that was anonymous that says, we know that we need to focus on the positive changes that are happening, but if we look at our report card of how we're doing globally, or particularly in Canada, we're not doing so great. How do we answer to our children who are asking how we are doing as a country?
Yeah, I think it's really important because these are urgent issues, and that urgency discourse is true. And so when we look at that, we can feel very frightened and really scared that even if we are making progress, we're not making progress fast enough. There's that kind of feeling. And I think what is interesting and why I think it matters so much what we measure is that we have used, the one measure that is a global measure when we look at greenhouse gas emissions. And yet we have lots of measures we need to look at because we know, I'm thinking especially your organization that's looking at the sustainable development goals, we know that our knowledge is patchy. There's some countries are very able to report on things. Some of our information is out of date, all of those kinds of things. And so that's why I think it matters to look in many different areas and look at the evidence that's happening in each of those different areas. So for example, with moving away from fossil fuels towards renewables, in terms of electricity generation is happening faster than we anticipated. So when we look at that, and then if you look at Project Drawdown that says, how important is that in the ranking of what happens globally? That's a very optimistic picture. That piece looks very good. And so we can look at that and say, okay, that's moving in the directions we need. We need more of that. Let's keep focusing that direction and empowering ourselves by knowing that, and then looking in areas where it's not moving as quickly and that sort of thing. So rather than seeing that one number and feeling no matter what, it's not going to make a difference. I think we really need to diversify what we measure and how we look at it. And I'm happy to say that's much more possible now than even a few years ago. I think one of the things that did come out of COVID has been much more sharing, and this is based in research, among scientists of their data. It started with people looking medically, but has kind of moved. And I think it was happening anyway, but it had a bit of a bump up. And now we have much more capacity for big data sets globally to have much more finesse around our understanding of which things are working and our understanding of which things we need to be moving. And that's a powerful thing.
Thanks, Ellen. And that you speaking to the widespread information that's available from experts leads me into our next question, which is from someone in the chat, Harvey, who asks, how do we address the widespread skepticism about evidence and facts and massive misinformation, especially by political-based news vehicles? So how do we face misinformation?
It's such a huge issue. It's such a huge issue, and I appreciate that question. And I mean, we talk about being in the age of misinformation. And so again, I think it's helpful to say, okay, what then is happening around misinformation? So what are the trends around information? And so, for example, the BBC just created a big forensics unit of 60 high-level forensics journalists to focus in on how verifiable is the information that they're putting out. And you can follow their ranking. I find that amazing. And I know in the UN system, for example, with the net zero pledges, that came forward from countries. The UN has also now created a body whose whole job it is to look to see what is the accountability to those pledges, so that we can feel, at least we can look at that measurement and follow it. And I used in the presentation the net zero tracker. That's just one of many trackers. So at the same time as we are feeling those feelings, we can also look, by complicating the narrative, of where are the measures sitting, and which ones can we feel more confidence in, because we can look at where those sources are coming from. We can look at where that information is happening. And that's why I think that the verifiability of the evidence is as crucial as the evidence.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. This is a question I appreciate a lot. So much of the hope is being directed towards youth in addressing climate change. However, what do you feel adults need to do in order to be useful allies to youth in addressing climate change?
Yeah. So it is interesting if you look at, let's say, Pew is an organization that does a lot of sort of tracking of attitudes and feelings of concern, those kinds of things around climate change. And in those cases, when you look across, at least in a North American context, Pew is looking, you will see that there's high levels of concern about climate change at every age demographic. You know, it isn't that one group doesn't care or another group does care. It's highly concerned. And that's why I think intergenerational collaborations are essential. That's what I really think, because then everybody is involved. Everybody is involved in whichever part they need. And I think that a huge part of this is the justice aspect of it. We know there's huge wealth disparity. We know there's huge, part of the reason I feel it's so important to collaborate with climate influencers is that they are essentially the dominant way in which we are hearing about climate change online. And we don't have a system collectively to fund them. You know, if you're a climate influencer, you are doing that usually on top of, you either need to have a corporate sponsor for something, or you are doing it on top of other gig economy jobs that you have. And so that is not a sustainable way to operate such a crucial area of engagement. And so I've been working with Queer, Brown, Vegan and the Solutions Journalism Network. Solutions Journalism Network has fellowships that they have for journalists, because it turns out that doing solutions journalism takes a bit more time, because you can look at a problem by yourself, but a solution you have to look across sectors, you have to work collaboratively. And so looking at how do we make it so that content creators online might be eligible for those kinds of fellowships, for example. So these are ways that I think it's a good example that the collaboration isn't just about what we put online together. It's about how do we support the sustainability of the system, which is how we're communicating. And that's an issue for all of us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elin. So this is more of a practical question, but we have someone in the chat looking for the names on the solution-based journalism slide. Would we possibly be able to share some of the information on the slides to the people here?
I'll make sure that you get that slide, especially because then you can just go and sign up for those or take a look from those. And once you start looking, you'll find more of them, and you'll find some. I do an assignment every year with my students where I ask them to spend 10 days and for half an hour every day, only looking at solutions journalism sources, just for that half hour, and then reflecting back on what they experienced. And what I know from that is that people have very different sites that they like, but it makes a huge impact on how they feel. And it drives them towards looking for more things that are in a solutions orientation. And the other part of that assignment is to spend half an hour outside every day and reflect on how that feels. And that also makes a big difference. Yeah.
That's great. I'm sure a lot of people came here to discover the resources that you have to share as well.
Yeah.
I know that for the sake of time, we only have a little bit more time for some questions. But this was another anonymous Q&A question we received. If we approach climate change through a lens of belonging and meaningfulness, it will be more impactful. How can educators help foster this meaningful involvement with their students?
I think that's so beautifully said. So beautifully said. And there's an Institute for Belonging and Othering that is at, I think it's Berkeley University of California, Berkeley. And that's exactly their standpoint. So they're talking about, and that sense of belonging, which situates our understanding right from the get-go that we are living in an unjust world. And to me, that is the crucial part of that, because that's why inclusion, it matters so much, because we're all of value and because we know that that is not our state, and so I think the ways that is really supported is I started with the idea of sharing feelings. We have strong feelings. We know that hope and anger, for example, are activating feelings. We feel activated to do things when we're angry about injustice, and that is why I think we have such a powerful movement around climate change, because it is unjust. And on behalf of other species, those sorts of feelings. And hope is very activating because we feel pride when we are accomplishing something, and we feel we are alongside someone else, in meaningful purpose. And I think collective care is a big part of belonging. So we know that self-care matters very much. In fact, there's a well-being institute that looks at when leaders of environmental organizations take care of themselves, not only do they have healthier organizations because they're more likely to put in policies that help that, but they have a bigger impact on the issue itself that the organization is trying to face. They're more effective in their work. And so well-being is a huge part of belonging, I think. And then I think that part I was trying to end with, which is around recognizing our own positionality. Where do I have the most influence in my life? How do I use that best? And what do I super care about that I'm going to keep doing, even if nobody else seems to be doing it, because I really care about it. And when I find other people who are also super keen on that, whether, it's craftivists who are using knitting or whatever it is, it can really, really empower us to keep going. And I think belonging is how we go, because one of the things I've really learned about hope and why I'm now interested in practices is that we live in such a focus on doomism. It's really hard to hold on to hope by yourself. You really need a culture of hope around you. And that happens when you have other people who are working in the same direction. So I think it's a cultural shift that comes from knowing our feelings, creating care for ourselves and others, and really operating from knowing what is working and coming at it from our unique positions.
Thank you, Ellen. And I think this could go on for another half hour. There are so many questions, and you have so much wisdom and just knowledge to offer. But just given the time, I think we have to stop here. And I'll pass it over to Bob to close out and final
Thank
thanks.
you, everyone, for your
much.
great questions. Thank you.
Wow, what a thoughtful, inspiring, and powerful presentation. That was absolutely wonderful. I noticed one of the questions in the chat was, can people get access to your slides? That may not be a fair question, but what I will say is LSF has a resources for rethinking, which is a curated group of huge number of resources for teachers to use. We may ask for your guidance in terms of things you have produced that could be shared through that, so that people can use them with their classes.
Yeah.
Jen, did I point in the right place on that? Yes, okay.
Yeah.
And maybe if I could just make one quick comment on that. Part of the reason I think it's so important, why I'm really think about slides a lot, is that I really am trying to talk about expiry dates really, really strongly. And every time I go to do this talk, I'm thrilled because I have to look again. I have to look again. And when I look again, I discover that. So I think that's really even more than it. I don't want something to become static that is actually about change.
That's fair enough. And I must say that you're the only person I've met who can go through PowerPoints faster than I can. On that note, I just want to say thank you to Jen, Genevieve, to Elaine and Pam at Learning for a Sustainable Future for making this possible. I hope others found it as transformative as I did. And again, a huge thank you to Ellen, to Philip for the work that the faculty at York are doing, and to David Bell for the leadership he showed in getting us here. Have a good evening or late afternoon for others. So good night.